You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Thomas Hazlett. Tom, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So our topic for today is a book that Thomas has written entitled The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone. This book and Thomas's work was mentioned in a recent episode of the show in the context of political change, which I'll link back to that episode on the show notes. But that conversation led me to this topic, which I find really interesting. So Thomas, one thing that really interested me about your work in particular is that you aren't just someone who wrote a book about the radio spectrum. You were actually an active participant in the movement to change the way the radio spectrum is allocated. So how about you start by talking a little bit about your background and your involvement in that?
Sure. Well, I am an academic economist, and so I don't want to take too much credit here. But I wrote a PhD dissertation in the 1980s at UCLA, which some jokingly called the University of Chicago at Los Angeles. And in fact, my thesis advisor was Harold Demsetz, who had gone from Chicago to UCLA a few years before. At any rate, I looked at how we regulated various monopolies and what were called natural monopolies, including cable television. And when I came out, I started looking a little more broadly and actually got an assignment to write a chapter on U.S. regulation of broadcasting. And that actually took me to some discoveries about the way radio spectrum, wireless frequencies, are allocated. That it just turns out that in the United States and virtually everywhere else on the planet, there's a great folklore about how there was endemic chaos, market failure, tragedy of the commons. And in fact, regulators had to step in with an administrative central planning approach to radio waves to salvage the wireless resource. And in fact, that's not at all what happened. There was a formative and extremely influential episode in the United States in the 1920s with the advent of radio broadcasting. But in fact, the initial regulatory system was one of property rights enforcement, backed up by the powers vested in the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in fact, the first come, first serve rule developed under Anglo common law was initiated. But that system had some political problems in the sense that the first and most successful commercial radio broadcasters that were established, they did not like the risk of having new entry facilitated by first come, first serve rule that would allow additional competition. At the same time, the initial policymakers in the United States, the most influential and important early policymaker was the first regulator of radio, the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, Herbert Hoover, later much more famous as President of the United States, but in fact an engineer who was very familiar with the technology and very comfortable with the businesses that actually got into broadcasting. And he really crafted a system that worked very well to establish first come, first serve, but was also leading the charge for more political discretion over who could broadcast and what they could say. And it was that political dimension that basically led to a coalition between the early incumbent commercial broadcasters and the political policymakers that resulted in the 1927 Radio Act in the United States, which was really foundational and highly influential, not just in the U.S., but all over the world in terms of how we think about and regulate radio spectrum. So it was that sort of centralization, the passing from market allocation to administrative allocation, that formed what I call the political spectrum, which is a phenomenon that's been with us ever since. In fact, the law in the United States is still based on the act passed in 1927.
Okay, that's interesting. So radio is discovered, I forget if it's early 20th century or late 19th century. I think 19th, right?
Yeah, but
And
usually Marconi is given credit for the first radio transmissions in about 1895.
hmm, and then thereafter, if you start a radio station and you start broadcasting on a certain frequency, it's treated under the law no different than if you had homesteaded some previously unoccupied piece of land, right? It's a property right that you gain by using that, being the first to use that resource, which
That
is interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and that actually teaches one a lot about how law is applied, particularly under common law, where precedents and dispute resolution are front and center, and that certainly is the system coming out of the United Kingdom and some of the British former British colonies, including the United States. So it really was a first pass to try to make order out of chaos and to encourage useful exploitation of a newly discovered resource. And so it really doesn't become an issue for the first 25 years of radio. When conflict comes into the market is literally in 1920, when the first broadcasting station develops. Up until then, we had ship-to-shore radio and what were called point-to-point communications, not that many radios in the marketplace. But as soon as a business innovator, in fact, Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, decides to blast radio emissions from a high point in Pittsburgh in all directions to try to go point to multi-point to potentially thousands of radio receivers all around, then that actually becomes a very popular model. And within 2 years, there are 500 broadcasting stations in the United States. That conflict forces some determination as to who owns the space. And the first reflex of the Secretary of Commerce, who had authority under a 1912 statute to minimize interference by a licensing scheme, well, the administrative approach was to have first come, first serve property rights. And so that actually is the development of radio all the way through 1926. In 1926, though, to try to finally force a new law that gave the Department of Commerce more discretion, Hoover ends that first come, first serve enforcement by the Department of Commerce. And now chaos does break out and anybody can go anywhere. And so there's a lot of wave jumping and what they called at the time piracy, where a couple of 100 new stations pop into the air. And so you've got, you go from 550 to 750 stations and lots of what they called also trespassing on previous stations' territory. So that gets to be a problem. And there actually is a court case out of Chicago, Illinois, where at state law in Illinois, there is a common law property right, and a judge, a county judge actually in Cook County, Chicago, orders a station to move back to its previous frequency and to leave WGN, owned by the Chicago Tribune in Chicago, to leave WGN's frequency alone. And so a system of property rights was recognized, but that's exactly what was motivating Congress to step in and to assert political jurisdiction. And they were, as I say, urged on by the powerful incumbent commercial stations that wanted a barrier to entry and a more political system for allocating spectrum. And so that's what we got in February of 1927 when the Radio Act was finally passed by Congress and then signed by President Calvin Coolidge at the behest of his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover.
Mm. So what kind of so in that situation where there wasn't much in the way of property rights, what incentive was there? What did people get out of infringing on other radio stations?
So that's a great question. And in fact, in 1920, when the first broadcasting station, starts operating, in fact, we know the day, November 2nd, 1920, to broadcast election returns in the presidential contest where President Harding won in the United States. you might ask the question, who would put in a broadcast station? There's no radio receivers out there, essentially. And who would buy a radio receiver if there's nothing to listen to? On the other hand, who would put out a broadcast station if there's no receiving public that has the radio equipment to get your signal? So it's a chicken or the egg problem, and it was solved, as I've already mentioned, by vertical integration. That is, say, Westinghouse was a manufacturer of many electronics products, including radio sets. So to sell radio sets, they put in a broadcasting facility. They operated free to the customer. The advertising model and the sponsorship model, they actually come a little later. It wasn't clear what the commercial business model was, but these interests, including the radio set sellers like RCA and Westinghouse and Zenith, they had certainly commercial interests right off the bat, as did some department stores and retail outlets, and then there were a lot of nonprofit organizations that came in, including labor unions and city governments, and of course universities. A lot of educational institutions wanted radio to communicate their educational mission. So there were a lot of different factors in there that were motivating the owners, but there was significant investment. By 1926, there were over 4 million U.S. households with radio sets. Now, by today's standards, we might sort of yawn because radio seems cheap and ubiquitous, which it is now. But in that day and age, those radios were consoles, and they cost, in today's dollars, between $1,500 and $2,000 a unit. And of course, at that time, that was a much larger share of annual income for the median worker. So there was a very significant investments being made, millions and millions of dollars being spent, both to create the broadcast facilities and then to buy receivers. And radio was, really the first mass market electronic media. And so you had millions of households investing, and hundreds of businesses also investing in facilities. And through this initial property scheme, there were actually radio stations bought and sold. And so 1923, 1924, you have stations transferring ownership, not just the facility, but also the right to broadcast. And the Department of Commerce was quite clear that if there was no more room on the dial for a new station, they were just telling applicants who wanted to get in and broadcast that they could go and buy a station. And so you have WGN, for example, the aforementioned station owned by the Chicago Tribune. By the way, the call letters WGN stand for World's Greatest Newspaper. And people are familiar with WGN, which is still a TV station, and the call letters are still applied. But the WGN, Chicago Tribune station, is purchased in 1924 for, if I recall correctly, about $250,000. That was an existing station, not a new assignment. So the system is developing, and the property is actually transacting or trading in secondary markets. And it was quite orderly. There was tremendous public acceptance. And as I say, millions of households were going out and buying radios. So the folklore develops. In fact, it's most prominently articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court in decisions in 1943 and then in 1969. It was summarized by some of the experts on the matter, including the Supreme Court, that indeed there was nothing but endemic chaos in the 1920s prior to the 1927 Radio Act. Well, that's clearly at odds with the facts, not only the reporting of the time and the general social phenomenon where radio was a craze long before the 27 Radio Act, but the millions of radio sets sold would not have been sold in a market where there was endemic chaos and interference, as alleged later by those who crafted this folklore, nor would you have had such investment on the supply side. So, or valuation for these valuable properties that we're trading for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there was a market that developed, and the question was how to go forward with rules for the future. And of course, that's what was decided in the 1927 Radio Act in the politicization of spectrum allocation.
Okay. So it starts out with, obviously no property rights because, nobody was using the radio spectrum. Then it goes to common law system of first come, first serve, and things work fairly well, and people buy and sell radio stations which have claims on parts of the radio spectrum. And then the government removes those sort of common law property rights protections, causing chaos, and then they bring in a different administrative system to fix the chaos they had recently created. Am I getting that timeline right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in the first line of the 1927 Radio Act, first sentence, says that you cannot assert a private right to the use of a channel against the U.S. government. The U.S. government has authority for what is done with radio spectrum, who shall have the rights, and how they shall be used. So it wasn't just that the government was coming in to be a traffic cop, which was often the rationale and the explanation for the system. The system was far, with traffic cops, they don't tell you exactly what car to drive, or who gets to be in the car, or what clothes you're wearing. And many of those decisions were made, in fact, by the regulators. They immediately started regulating the content of the radio stations and imposing equal time rules and what later became known as the Fairness Doctrine. That actually starts in the late 1920s, where the government is very critical of the fact that stations owned by labor unions and political operatives, including the Socialist Party, that owned a station dedicated to the memory of Eugene V. Debs, that they were propaganda stations, according to the Federal Radio Commission, and that they were not serving the general public, and they were admonished for this and basically driven off political commentary and opinionated content. And so the regulatory aspects of this are very clear. It was not just being a traffic cop; it was also controlling this very valuable form of political speech. And of course, at the same time, it restricted entry into the market. So the licenses became far more valuable than they would have been in a more competitive market. And these licenses got to be assigned and then regulated by political institutions, and ultimately with oversight by Congress and the White House. So you get, again, the political spectrum replacing, market allocation of frequencies.
So was this a major source of revenue for the government?
No, because the decision was made not to charge for the rights being issued. Quite the reverse. There were, from the very beginning, you can go back all the way to 1927, and people didn't explicitly say auction, so far as I could tell, but they did say that there should be, some people had the idea, including the American Bar Association, that you might have some kind of a payment system to obtain rights. But the government and the policymakers steadfastly refused. They wanted a zero price license, and they wanted competition, political competition, so that regulators could essentially be at the center of a rent-seeking rivalry, and they could make implicit demands that would not violate the First Amendment to the Constitution, which says quite up front, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. It was clearly the case, and it was seen in the 1920s, in the early days of radio, that the radio was an instrument of speech and of the press, a new form of electronic media. David Sarnoff, famously president of RCA, was arguing for First Amendment rights about 1924 for the radio industry. And there was a kind of a fine line that the regulators were walking, and what they ended up doing in the 27 Radio Act was, in fact, skirting the First Amendment by saying, well, of course, we have First Amendment rights and there can be no censorship by government, but we have to assign the rights very carefully, and we have to take account of what their content is, because there are only so many to go around. Well, that was a byproduct of the fact that there was no auction. There was no price. Of course, at a zero price, there's going to be excess demand. And this is what Ronald Coase clearly saw and so stridently objected to in the logic behind the regulatory system for radio and television. And he wrote a paper in 1959 that led to his much more famous 1960 article on the problem of social cost, which really went into quite a bit of detail about this idea that somehow there was a limitation on the number of rights. He said, well, of course, there's a great limitation, and there's great demand for these rights because you're keeping the price at zero. So that's normally a problem of allocation that we solve in a market economy through the use of ownership on the one side, and then auctions. The resource goes to the highest valued bidder. Or the highest bidder for its highest valued use. So he was onto something with that, and in fact, he went quite a bit further to talk about allocating radio rights through markets, assign ownership to frequencies, and let consumers dictate where radio spectrum was used and how it was used, and how new business models could form or technologies come into the market. No need for the government to do that. The government could confine its role to simply figuring out the borders, just like with land or oil or other natural resources. The invisible resource, radio spectrum, could be the subject of property rights. Interestingly, Coase didn't really go back to the 20s and draw a line to what he was talking about 30, 40 years later. And that's something that I ended up doing, sometime after that in an article published also with 30, 40 years after Coase in the Journal of Law and Economics. But Coase went along with sort of the traditional explanation that there had been no property rights in the 1920s. And of course, he says you're going to get chaos that way. Nobody ever thought about doing property rights, and that would be an alternative. He really didn't understand that they had property rights, and they abandoned those property rights for political/public choice reasons. But he was very right about the possibility to use property rights in spectrum. And so really the more modern and more positive take on this whole development of law is that while we still have the 1927 Radio Act governing the administrative allocation of spectrum, and as I say, there really is a parallel solution in virtually all other countries that follows this basic pattern from the U.S., that indeed we have had through regulatory reform and visionaries even within the regulatory system, we have had a great liberalization take place over the last few decades, since the 1970s and 80s. We have really stepped towards a system of de facto property ownership for frequencies. That is to say, if you look at mobile markets today, the radio spectrum there is much relaxed in terms of the controls and mandates levied for technologies, services, applications, business models. All of those things were mandated for radio broadcasting, television broadcasting, satellite broadcasting early on. Finally, by the time we got to the 1980s and finally got cellular licenses out, over 30 years, by the way, after cellular was invented, it was bottled up in the old administrative allocation system for decades. But when cellular finally started getting in the marketplace for various reasons that I talk about in the book, but won't go into right here, but for various reasons, the politics were much different than with broadcasting. And the technology was also a lot more complicated in terms of micromanagement, and it just didn't make sense, even in the government's own terms, to have the same pro-scarcity policy. And so with cellular starting in the 1980s and then going down to the second generation, which was digital phone, and third generation, which was broadband, fourth generation, faster and better, and now fifth generation wireless that we're going into, you get competition. You get virtually every country in the world now has got multiple private carriers, usually 3 or 4 nationwide networks, having de facto private control over fairly wide swaths of radio spectrum, so that these companies can determine what goes in and what interferes with what else and what can be limited. So that's the amazing story here, that we have made progress, and that only through developing, ironic as it is, because it is through an administrative allocation system, but only by developing a system of de facto property rights where you have competitors in the market determine what radios, what devices, iPhones, smartphones, all the development in the mobile markets has been really a product very closely tied to this relaxation of the top-down rules, the micromanagement that was said to be necessary to stop interference between all these competing uses of radio frequencies. The only way you actually get that, and literally get more than a million apps available on either the App Store for Apple and its ecosystem or the competing Google Play ecosystem, all these applications interfere with each other. I mean, everything from Facebook to Twitter to Angry Birds to your dog tracker. All of these applications are competing to share radio space. And the old endemic chaos that the government talked about, that the private sector couldn't handle it, it's literally, given the history of this, it's inconceivable that the complexity of today's mobile ecosystems could be administered centrally. You have to have these competing platforms coordinate with the radio makers and the application vendors and the infrastructure companies and the technology suppliers, the chip makers. All of this complexity that's in that marketplace today provides for, literally traffic flows that are millions of times greater than those said to implicate too much complexity for a private market. And in fact, the reverse turned out to be true. Only through relaxation of that, that micromanaged central administration have you been able to get things like the smartphone revolution.
Yeah, it's a really interesting process where it went from property rights to central allocation and then back many decades later. Coase was particularly prescient in 59 and 60, arguing for property rights in the spectrum. And, but at that time, it was just sort of a, wild idea from some academics. You yourself later, joined with Coase and others in arguing for this. Can you talk about the process that led to the spectrum auctions? Like, how did that go from an academic idea to something that many governments around the world all agreed to?
Yeah, so it's fascinating, and in fact, we don't know exactly how that process played out. There were visionaries like Coase who came from academia, and Coase had some adherents amongst economics. So economics might, as a profession, give itself a little pat on the back. In communications and in engineering and law, you had widespread resistance. And in fact, Coase in 1959 was asked to testify in front of the Federal Communications Commission in Washington. And the first question he got from a commissioner, "Tell us, Professor Coase, is this all a big joke?" And, as I like to say, well, yeah, and the punchline is Coase was right. He had this wacky idea, and he was vilified. And in fact, a couple other people, including a young law student at the University of Chicago, who in the early 1950s had not been influenced by Milton Friedman or Aaron Director or Ronald Coase. This was far, far before Coase got to the University of Chicago. But a young student, Leo Herzl, who had read Abba Lerner, The Economics of Control, sort of the Bible of socialism, and thought, well, marginal cost pricing is good, and we can use auctions to find out the opportunity cost of these resource uses, and we could have an auction. And so Leo Herzl in 1951 is actually publishing the idea about auctions in the University of Chicago Law Review. Well, he was savaged by the then chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission, who said this was hopelessly naive, and again, sort of repeating what the Supreme Court had been talking about in terms of endemic chaos and market failure. And there were a couple of economists who picked up that theme, but for the most part, and by the 1960s, you had many economists at the Brookings Institution and Stanford University and elsewhere who were very interested in this idea of auctions. it was not politically feasible. And in fact, as late as 1977, when a commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission actually suggested that maybe this would happen, and that is a law. This is Glenn Robinson, was and has been a great writer on the subject, a law professor, retired now at the University of Virginia. He suggested that auctions might be the way to go. Well, two other commissioners at the FCC made a point of savaging Robinson's comment by saying in an official FCC document, again, 1977, that the chances that we would ever have auctions for wireless licenses were about the same as the odds on the Easter Bunny in the Preakness. So, which of course is one of the big horse races in the United States, the Triple Crown. And so the punchline there is, well, they should have bet on the bunny. And it was about a decade and a half later, it was 1993, that there actually was congressional authorization for auctions. And 1994, the first auctions in the U.S. were held. This was actually after New Zealand had launched a very big reform and adopted the policy of auctions in 1989, and it was about 1990 that they started auctioning licenses, and so this was sort of in the air, and Coase gets a lot of the credit correctly for pushing it in academic circles. What was holding it up was that within the political world, there were very big interests against it, including the broadcasters, who had a very good political deal and got all the spectrum they wanted and used that to foreclose entry within broadcasting, and even to foreclose upstarts in the 1960s like cable TV. And they argued against auctions very, very strongly, and they had a lot of clout. And even U.S. government agencies were against liberalization of spectrum, the Department of Defense and so forth. And so there was a lot of resistance. And within Congress, the U.S. Congress, the head of the Appropriations Committee and the budget committees, they tended to like auctions generating revenue. Why give these valuable rights away? You could generate billions. In fact, now, since we've gone to auctions, I told you the end of the story. 25 years ago, we've raised well over $100 billion in auctions that are ongoing as we speak. But the oversight committees, the ones who actually had authority, legislative authority and oversight over communications regulation, they liked having the rent seeking, which was intensified, of course, by the zero price regime. And so they very strongly kicked back, and they generally had deference amongst their colleagues that no reforms would take place. What finally happens, actually, in 1993, there had been Democratic and Republican administrations that had come out for auctions. The Carter administration had asked for auction authority, the Bush and Reagan administrations, Republicans and Democrats. But finally, it lined up in 1993. There was a very strong pitch made by the Secretary Brown, who was Commerce Secretary under Clinton in the first administration. The Democrats controlled the White House and both houses of Congress. Now there was no real reason to resist the White House getting this authority, and the executive branch was strongly pushing for it. And it would help rationalize the system and just get the licenses out faster and more efficiently to companies that had the highest demand. And so we actually, before we went to auctions in the 1980s to get cellular licenses out, went to lotteries, which is a wild system because now there's no public interest. The government's not even pretending it's selecting the right companies, which is the old pretense in the beauty contest system called beauty contests everywhere. The United States, except the United States, we call them comparative hearings. But they're really just warring groups of lawyers saying, oh, we're more in the public interest than you are, and trying to paper that claim up when it's all about these economic rents or transfers. So finally, we went to in the 80s, we did go to lotteries, and that seemed crazy to people that the government should be giving away tens of billions of dollars in value and then having these licenses as soon as they had owners through lotteries flip from these small little lottery winners to major telecommunications operators. And then finally, we got the authority, the politics lined up. There was a new technology called 2G, or it was called PCS, Personal Communication Systems in the United States. But that was the first digital phone system here. And there was hundreds of licenses that were waiting to be allocated, and there was some interest in getting those licenses out. It would come much faster with these auctions than it would with the lotteries that took really from 1984 to 1989 just to have the process run for cellular. So 1994 and 1995, 1996, all through that period, we did have lotteries to distribute lots of spectrum rights for the second generation of cellular telephones. And from there, countries all over the world, scores of countries now auction, everywhere from Nigeria to South Korea, Canada, the United States, certainly all over Europe, Guatemala, El Salvador, New Zealand, Australia. So it's a phenom, and really there's a cottage industry now of auction design and auction consulting. I've done a little bit of that myself, but economists have pushed strongly for that, and on the whole, it's been a very, very good step forward. I might say, just as an important point here, auctions are a very useful reform. They're a step in the right direction, but the primary thing that's happened that has unleashed the real innovation in this entire wireless sector is not the assignment of the rights by auction. It's the flexibility in the assignment, so that when a company does win an auction award, they have the right to determine what technology, what radio devices, do they want to use an iPhone? Your cellular company okays all the devices used on that space, and they figure out the compatibility and what applications can come in and what the network architecture looks like. Where do they put the base stations? How powerful is your local signal versus the signals used next door to you or in the next cell? And, and so you get things, innovations, just like texting. Texting takes very little bandwidth and just sort of naturally flowed from the flexible rights that were issued. Those were not mandated by government. Those were discovered by markets. And so too with broadband and the great use, of course, of mobile devices, and some of the mobile devices are bigger than your phones, but all the devices now that use wireless as the link, whether it be for video or internet access for websites and data processing and all kinds of tremendous new markets, whether it be machine to machine or health monitoring and the wearables that many people are now using to get your vitals monitored and to regulate your health in a more productive way. So all this stuff has had to be discovered, of course, and all these applications through the airspace are potentially conflicting. And how we regulate that through market competition is tremendously more valuable than the old system, where you literally had to apply to a government bureaucrat and convince the bureaucrat that your new idea for use of radio spectrum was in the public interest. And the first question was, won't it interfere? Well, the answer, almost always, if a new application is popular, is yes. And as Coase pointed out in 1959, the question is not to eliminate interference, it's to choose the most valuable applications. Sometimes you want new interference. In fact, many times you want new interference. You want to coordinate well and try to manage the costs and the interference it tosses out, the conflicts with other services. But just think if we, wanted to protect, AM broadcasting and, what was big in 1927 and protect everything that comes against it. Well, in fact, that was the system. And in my book, I give an analogy, two examples in history. In the 1934, FM radio is invented by one of the great inventors of the last century, Edwin Howard Armstrong, who had gotten wealthy actually as a professor at Columbia, contributing to the AM, the first radio broadcasting standard. But now he had a better mousetrap, FM, high fidelity, beautiful for music. And he had a tough time getting the FCC to actually authorize his use of the airwaves because the FCC checked with all the incumbent broadcasters and they said, oh, it didn't work. FM doesn't work, only AM. Well, after a few years, he finally overcame that. This is the leading radio engineer of his day, inventor and entrepreneur. And finally, by World War II, there's 500,000 of these big, new, expensive FM radio consoles in use, receiving signals in the Northeast United States. The World War II comes and stops all civilian use. And Armstrong himself goes and works for the Allies in World War II, becomes a major doing radio technology for Patton's Third Army and other parts of our Allied effort. Anyway, after the war, the Federal Communications Commission, at the behest of AM and new TV broadcasters, completely throws the old FM allocation off the dial, gives it an entirely new allocation, and destroys, literally renders obsolete the entire industry, all the transmitters, all the receivers. And on a very specious technical argument that Edwin Howard Armstrong argued vehemently against, produced voluminous evidence, scientific evidence against, but it destroyed the industry for 20 years. And Armstrong didn't live to see the day when in the 1960s, his dream became practical when the FCC finally allowed FM to compete head-to-head against AM, and within a few short years, FM totally overtakes AM, particularly for music. But in 1954, Edwin Howard Armstrong, humiliated and completely depressed over the suppression of FM radio through spectrum allocation, commits suicide, 63 years old, walks out of an 11th floor apartment in New York City. And one of the great inventors of the century is gone. Fast forward, I mean, that's a metaphor for the graveyard for innovation. Fast forward to 2005, when another great inventor is thinking about a new radio. And of course, that's Steve Jobs, Cupertino, California. He wants a beautiful cell phone, something that's so fantastic, it puts all the other old cell phones to shame. And he comes up with the iPhone. He doesn't have to go to the government to ask permission. No more mother may I. He goes to the market and he plays the carriers off against each other. And his, product becomes so desirable on the from consumers and such a rage and so iconic that he actually gets the carriers to bid against each other and pay him. He doesn't have to pay to get access. But the point is, your iPhone is worthless without access to radio spectrum. And that radio spectrum is now controlled by competitors in the marketplace. Again, not just in the US, but all over the world. And that's why the iPhone comes in so seamlessly. And there's no terrible episode as there was with Edwin Howard Armstrong, coming in and getting totally baffled and in fact rejected by the regulatory system, and consumers not being able to call the shots by buying the radios. Here, the radios come in and take the market by storm, and they do it so effectively that immediately there's market reaction. Nokia smartphone, which was 50% of the market, they were the dominant smartphone. And then the BlackBerry, that was number 2. They're just crushed by the new innovation. And out of nowhere comes the Google Android platform. And of course, Samsung and other competitors arise to challenge Apple, and they have a very vibrant competition to this day with, people the world over, 2 billion people and counting, getting smartphones to join the latest technological revolution. But while, science and technology look like they're responsible, and of course, in large portion they are, the real innovation there is liberalization, the fact that property rights are now owned by competitors in the marketplace and can welcome innovation. Each of the carriers wanting to have great new devices and then regulating the interference that comes from those devices and applications and doing so in an efficient way relative to the way that was done under the micromanaged regulatory system.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about just, where we'd be today if incumbents could block new technologies, at least with respect to the radio spectrum in the way they did FM radio, we'd still be, just halfway through the big fight to get, iPhones allowed on the radio spectrum, and we'd all be texting on our little Nokia phones, and losing the benefits of all this, rapidly innovating technology.
Yeah, and fitting with that, I mean, I think unfortunately, that's exactly right. And in fact, as I say in the book, with all the progress here, and I mean, we have proof of concept, we can see that Coase's vision, which was really a dream, he didn't see the markets operating to reallocate spectrum because of the regulatory system had not cleared out these barriers at that point. But it was just from first principles. He thought markets could work. Didn't know, by the way. I mean, he didn't say for sure it would really be the way to go. He said, let's do the experiment. I think that the government is highly inefficient and markets could figure this out, but maybe the transaction costs will be too much. Maybe it'll be a situation where we can't really improve upon the present. But it turns out that idea had amazingly more oomph than even Coase might have imagined. It was great that he lived to be 102. Unlike Edwin Howard Armstrong, who ended things too early, he got to see that this idea really packed a wallop and could take us to amazing places in terms of the competition and innovation. But I will say, as I said in the book, that we're not even halfway there in terms of freeing up all the impediments. That is to say, there's just it's still the case that most spectrum is tied down in these legacy allocations. Now, the mobile market's sort of the good story, but there are many other allocations for all kinds, whether it be microwave or, radio and television broadcasting or certain satellite services and on and on, particularly government allocations. The forestry famously has allocations in New York City. And, of course, the Department of Defense has maybe 40% of the utilizable spectrum just sort of tied up. And it's important to have the military with access to radio waves, no doubt about that. We want reasonable technology and communications for our national defense, but the problem is still there. That is to say that the actors, particularly the state actors that have jurisdiction over a lot of important frequencies, they don't have good incentives to make that spectrum available for its highest valued use. They have very tight bureaucratic constraints on them. And it's not that the people in the military are not good natured or smart or that they want the economy and new technologies to do well. It's that they do have missions, and they are not compensated for being creative of how they turn airwaves over for civilian use. They're compensated quite the other way for completing their mission and having all kinds of redundancy built into the system. So we're still trying to come up with ways to pry loose, much, if not most, of the spectrum that's still out there. And as we go to 5G, fifth generation wireless technology, there's all kinds of new demands right now. And there's all kinds of interesting experiments happening in the United States and around the planet. How can we free up the old vested spectrum allocations and get the legacy into the modern market? So there's actually, for example, right now, a big band, which is called mid-band spectrum now, very valuable. They're thought to be very valuable for fifth generation wireless terrestrial, our smartphones, and it's been allocated to satellites that deliver TV product to broadcasters and cable companies, not direct to the customer, as with say Dish or DirecTV, but on the wholesale side. At any rate, this is a huge allocation, and in fact, the satellite licensees are themselves trying to get the government to give them flexibility in the use rights, so that they could make some investments, be more economical in the way they use this big so-called 500 megahertz block of radio frequencies, and get most of it, maybe 60% or more, into 5G, so that they would like to then sell the rights to carriers like Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile. And that's a very interesting process, how that is working out into the market. Lots of conflicts, people worried about windfalls, people worried about the way the transition takes place. Lots of politics in that, lots of rigidities. But overall, the pressure to move forward to 5G and the experience we've had with how productive liberalization has been, allowing markets to create new technologies and pretty amazing new stuff for consumers. All of that is pushing towards a more regulatory reform, and it's actually quite exciting to see this. And it's nice, if you're an economist, to know that a lot of these ideas really did start with economists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the topics we talk about on this show have much less positive stories where, maybe all the economists or a lot of economists have a consensus that we should be doing things one way, and yet the policy persists being the other way or not so good way. But at least with respect to the wireless spectrum, it really seems like good policy and good ideas have won out in the long term, and that's very positive to see.
Yeah, I don't want to be, at a high level, I think that's exactly right, and I strongly believe what you just said. But when you get down in any policy area, you get down in the weeds, there's still, under the 1927 Radio Act, there's still a lot of opportunities for, rent seeking and different distributions and, outright blocking and rents to be derived from blocking progressive policies. And so there's a lot of discussion, and there is some disagreement amongst economists as to exactly what the right way to go is. And so, if people want to, drill down on this, and I certainly talk about this in some of the later pages of my book, some of the experience we've had in the last couple of decades with policies that have been very slow. In fact, in the United States, we have another so-called mid-band frequency right next to the satellite band I just referenced that has been held up. And the U.S. is very slow on what's called 3.5 gigahertz, getting those frequencies out in good, liberal, flexible use fashion. And we're behind countries like Ireland and Finland and Germany and South Korea and Chile. And all over the world, countries are moving forward on this and getting competitive carriers vested, usually by auction, with new property rights over frequencies that are extremely valuable for 5G. The United States has tried to micromanage on the suggestion of various interest groups in the market that have different ideas for how those property rights should be configured. And we've actually had a very fragmentary policy there that has made it very hard. In fact, even on the regulatory side, we've gone so slow that we're not going to have any auctions until probably 2021, 2022 for this big chunk of frequencies that, to be honest, is the number one new band being used around the globe for 5G. So, in terms of where we are, yeah, the battle's not half won. Maybe that's about right. And we still need to learn from these lessons of old. Even though there's been such powerful proof of concept that what Coase was talking about is socially productive.
Yeah, we're not all the way there, but we're on the right track, and that's good to know. So we're getting to the end of our time. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any sort of broad takeaways that someone who's listened to this conversation should come away with it from?
Well, yeah, I think the basic thing that I've sort of stumbled into that I suppose surprises me a little bit and surprises other people I talk to. People are fascinated by the technologies we have, and we live in the internet age, and communications have changed so radically in the lifetimes of most of us, and of course, the kids growing up in this environment, they they just take wireless for granted. It's just a background amenity. They consider it normal. Well, historically, it's been something of a magic trick. This idea that you just turn on a device and all of a sudden it brings you information from all over the world or even beyond the planet. And it's great technology and it's wonderful science. But what really is stark once you really get into the development of this marketplace is how much economics and public policy has been absolutely essential to unlocking the science and technology. And so, I just have a different perspective on it now when people talk about how great the technical advance is, and I certainly have no problem with charting that progress. It's so important for society and the economy, but you really get a lot of suppression of technology over time when you have the bad rules in place. And when you can do better and have a more progressive system that rewards innovation and allows competition to be on the merits and, welcomes the technology, that's when you really you get amazed by the science that's available. And so that's something that I really, think people ought to, take a minute to think about and maybe explore some. And so to the extent that economists do that and historians and political scientists and lawyers and engineers, I think that we're better off to have that kind of understanding.
All right. And on that note, we'll finish. My guest today has been Thomas Hazlett. The book we are discussing is The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone, which I'll link to at economicsdetective.com. Thomas, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Well, Garrett, thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio as much as I enjoyed making it. There's really a lot of interesting stuff there that I didn't know about, and I look forward to learning more about radio spectrum in the future. If you enjoy the show and you want to help support it, you can go to patreon.com/economicsdetective or click through the link to Patreon on economicsdetective.com. It's in the menu up at the top there. Patreon allows you to make a recurring donation, in this case on a per episode basis. We have lots of supporting patrons, people like Nick, Hugo, and Luke, our most recent patrons, who help me to offset costs and to continue making the show at high quality and on a regular basis. So thanks to everyone who supports me on Patreon. I'll be back soon with a new episode.